Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
Don't worry, we'll get through this together.
Okay.
Thank
As
you.
a reminder, the views and analysis presented are entirely Rabbi Harris's and do not speak officially for West End Synagogue or Reconstructing Judaism as an organization. I did want to stress, though, that the course presents both narratives. Rabbi Harris approaches the subject from a progressive Zionist perspective while urging people to seek out and explore other points of view as well. The lecture should take about an hour and a quarter. To keep things flowing smoothly, Rabbi Harris will take questions at the end that are written in the chat. So save your questions if possible. Write them down in the chat close to the end, which is when we will put the chat back on. And please try to keep them short. We will close the chat shortly and open it near the end for questions. Thank you all, and let's begin.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate that lovely introduction and all the disclaimers. And I want to add one more thing, which is that I want to just name the fact that we're coming together. It's still a time of a lot of stress and pain and fear and anxiety in our communities. We are still dealing with the reality of Israel at war. We passed 100 days of captivity for the hostages and their families, and the ongoing nightmare that is unfolding for Gazan civilians continues, as well as the disagreements and difficulties to sometimes even address or talk about aspects of what's going on among our own families, between generations, between colleagues and friends. This is a really hard time, and I want to say thank you to you for deciding that despite all of that, or maybe in part because of all of that, you're willing to muster the courage to hear me offer my take on my understanding of these two narratives. So let's begin. I want to make sure we're able to jump right in, and there will be a recording of this session as well, and we can share links to the previous sessions as needed. This is part two. And part two is the founding of Israel, the birth of the Palestinian refugee crisis, and a chronic stalemate. So one of the first major challenges that the UN faced was the crisis of what to do with about 250,000 Jewish refugees living in European displaced persons camps after World War II had ended. These DP camps were often squalid and horrible. Another big issue that the UN had to face was the question of Palestine. Exhausted from war and facing terrible debt, the British wanted to focus on rebuilding their homeland and departing from India, which would become independent in August 1947. They announced that they were leaving Palestine in 1948. The UN sent diplomats to attempt negotiations between the leaders of the Yishuv, the Hebrew name for the Jews living in Palestine, and Palestinian Arab leaders. For the most part, Zionist leaders were willing to participate in these talks, and Palestinian leaders were not. From the Jews' vantage point, the likely result of negotiations with the Palestinians would be the emergence of some kind of Jewish state, even a very small one, which would achieve one of their long-standing goals, officially getting on the map. Palestinian leaders thought these negotiations were a setup. They felt that through the UN, they were being pressured by the most powerful nations at the time to capitulate to an outcome they had never thought was just, namely giving up land to a group of outsiders whose Jewish nation-building plan they had never agreed to. It's important also to remember that the leaders representing Palestinians were at an organizational disadvantage compared to the Zionist leadership. The carving up of the map of the Middle East by Britain and France before the war had led to the establishment of new Arab nation states like Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, and European maneuvering had led to each of these states being headed by monarchs who were either outsiders to the lands they now were appointed to rule, or otherwise questionable in their legitimacy in the eyes of their subjects for other reasons. So at the same time that much of the most experienced Palestinian leaders remained expelled from the territory by the British, if you recall from last session, that happened during the Palestinian uprising of the late 1930s. Those Arab leaders who were still in Palestine struggled to navigate the complex puzzle of coordinating with one another, as well as attempting to coordinate with what was a new assortment of Western-backed Arab monarchies trying to fortify their control over their own frustrated citizens. As the British prepared to leave, the conflict between the Zionists, who now urgently were trying to bring Holocaust survivors to the land, and the Palestinians looked to be unresolvable. In one of its first major decisions, the United Nations voted to approve the 1947 Partition Plan, which sought to establish a Jewish and a Palestinian state in the shaded regions you see on the slide. We'll talk more about that and come back to this map soon. All in all, in the summer of 1948, the British finally left Palestine for good. Now, let's turn to the Jewish narrative. As the British left Palestine in May of 1948, the Zionists declared their independence in the territory described in the 1947 Partition Plan. The Soviet Union was the first nation to recognize the State of Israel, with the United States fast on its heels. Although battles had already taken place between the Zionists and Palestinian Arab forces before Israel declared its independence, Israel's declaration was followed by a coordinated attack on the new state by a coalition of Egyptian, Syrian, Jordanian, Lebanese, Iraqi, and local Palestinian forces. The Israelis were better prepared for the war, and they had the advantage of having a single chain of command and system of military communication, whereas the disparate Arab forces had to try to communicate across half a dozen different militaries, each with different levels of experience and training and different political agendas. That said, the Arab armies had one very important advantage, namely the ability to retreat and regroup if specific military strategies did not succeed. The ability to retreat and resupply, to pull back and plan for a more advantageous situation in the near future is a crucial strategic asset. The Israelis had nowhere to retreat to. It was literally do or die for them. That fact motivated the Israelis to be daring and intense in their fighting. At this time, Israel did not have the generous military aid and ardent diplomatic support of the United States. Their main weapons supplier was Czechoslovakia, who sold them arms with the approval of Joseph Stalin, who thought that Israel might become a Soviet ally, given the socialist roots of much of the Zionist movement. That strategic support for Israel on Stalin's part would prove to be very short-lived. More on that later. Meanwhile, in this war, Israelis felt like they had no one to save them but themselves, and that they had one chance to solidify the state they had dreamed of achieving for decades. The War of Independence, as Israelis call it, would end in an emphatic victory, but it was not a rout on all fronts. Jordanian forces were highly trained and very successful. They captured the old city of Jerusalem. They expelled the entire Jewish population of Eastern Jerusalem, about 100,000 people, all told, and destroyed dozens of synagogues. The photo on the left shows Jewish refugees from Jerusalem being allowed safe passage out of the city during a temporary ceasefire following Jordanian victories, and Red Cross personnel assisting them. There were also several massacres against Jews carried out by Arab forces during the war, including in the areas surrounding Jerusalem. The war finally ended when the UN brokered an armistice agreement between Israel, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. The Israelis had increased their land holdings beyond the territory that the UN had approved to be part of the Jewish state in the 1947 partition plan. Try to compare the green parts in the map on the left with the yellow parts in the map on the right to see what I mean. There were other territorial winners too. Sorry about that. There were other territorial winners too. Egypt took over the Gaza Strip. Jordan took control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, including the Old City. There was no internationally approved decision about the permanent boundaries of Israel. There was just an armistice agreement. And of course, there were now almost 800,000 Palestinian refugees from the war, which the Israeli government insisted was entirely the fault of the invading Arab nations. Prime Minister Ben-Gurion's government insisted that Israel would only consider negotiating on the refugee issue within the framework of regional peace talks with the Arab states involved in the war, peace talks that would treat Israel as a permanent state in the region. That was a non-starter for the Arab states and the Palestinians as well. In the Jewish narrative, the War of 1948 is kind of like the Rocky story. Against all odds, a battered and scrappy underdog overcomes obstacles and is able to win a place in the world. Israeli losses were heavy. 1% of the entire Jewish population at the time was killed in action. But the Jewish state was not vanquished, and for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, an independent Jewish nation in the Holy Land had fought and defended its sovereignty successfully. Take a moment to think about what the news of the Israeli victory in 1949 would have felt like to Jews around the world, just some 4 years after Jews were still being gassed in death camps. Our Jewish narrative is powerful and real within the framework of meaning in which it takes place. For the Jews of the moment, who had long thought of themselves as a people spread across the globe, but united by faith, history, and ties to their homeland, and who had experienced for so many centuries the precariousness of constantly shifting cycles of being welcomed and then being hated or expelled. The news that the new Jewish state won this war felt like a miracle. The fact that the best-known armies that fought the Israelis came from well-known historical places like Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, also obscured the place of the Palestinian Arabs who had also fought, but who ultimately lost the hundreds of villages and towns that they had called home for centuries. If I can offer a moral lesson for all of us in thinking about this, it's this. Two things can be true at once and both deserve understanding and recognition. It's really true that Jews worldwide were stunned, amazed, and inspired by Israel's victory in 48 and 49. And it's really true that for Jews, it meant that Jews finally had what the other permanent nation states of the world had, a state of their own. And since there were also many Arab states, Jews stayed with what I have been calling a bird's eye view of the conflict, one in which what they assumed what was most important to any national group was the chance to have an adequately sized, defensible territory for national liberation and self-determination. The concerns about the new mass of Palestinian refugees by diplomats at the UN, which now had to rally its resources to address a brand new humanitarian crisis, seemed to many Jews to miss the point of the main meaning of the war. The Jews were finally on the map and in a position to defend themselves. Everything else, including sorting out the conditions under which Israel might negotiate about the fate of the Palestinian refugees, seemed smaller in the Jewish mythic narrative. As I say, two things can be true at once. There's a lot of truth in the Jewish narrative, especially emotional truth. And there's a counter narrative that tells a very different story, and which is also intensely true for Palestinians and filled with events and facts that are equally true. Okay, so let's pause, take a breath. We're going to pivot to the Palestinian narrative. And again, I'll repeat the important caveat I made last session. There are things I may not get right because I have not lived inside the Palestinian experience. So please seek information from multiple sources, including from Palestinians themselves. I also want to say, before we continue, for many Jews, learning the details of the Palestinian narrative of this period can be disorienting, painful, or shocking. If flooded with questions, I'd like to ask you to be patient and know that we'll have a chance, especially during Q&A, to discuss some of the questions and reactions that the material brings up. So with that in mind, a Palestinian narrative of this time goes something like this. For Palestinians, the events of 1947 to 49 are known as al-Nakba, the catastrophe. Ben-Gurion's government and the military he commanded knew that they had the upper hand in terms of weapons, trained soldiers, and timing when the British announced their impending exit from Palestine. Rather than the story of Jewish underdogs miraculously defeating a juggernaut of Arab armies, for Palestinians, betrayal in 1980 dominated by Western powers, the United Nations, taking upon itself the decision to give half the territory away to the Zionists against the express wishes of the indigenous population. Jewish residents at that time made up far less than 50% of the population, yet they were awarded half the country. The Jewish leadership knew that they would have a chance to move fast against Palestinian towns and villages once the world would be far too exhausted from World War II to intervene. In fact, Jewish forces had already begun expelling Palestinians from villages even before the War of 1948 broke out, causing alarm and fear to spread, not only through Palestinian communities, but throughout much of the neighboring Arab world, that the most powerful countries in the post-war order had decided to abandon the Palestinians to imminent displacement by the far better equipped and prepared Zionist military forces the moment the British left the scene. Let me read that sentence again. I think I misspoke. In fact, Jewish forces had already begun expelling Palestinians from villages even before the War of 1948 broke out, causing alarm and fear to spread not only through Palestinian communities, but throughout much of the neighboring Arab world, that the most powerful countries in the post-war order had decided to abandon the Palestinians to imminent displacement by the far better equipped and prepared Zionist military forces the moment the British left the scene. I think that sentence still needs work, but I think you get the idea. When Israel declared independence, Zionist leaders swiftly implemented plans that they had had for a long time to do as much, and again, this is the Palestinian narrative, to do as much ethnic cleansing as possible under the cover of war, resulting in the massive refugee crisis that the war left in its wake. The plan that the Haganah, the primary Israeli military force during the war, developed for systemic ethnic cleansing during the war was called Plan Dalet. The map on the right shows red dots where about 550 Palestinian towns and villages were uprooted during the war. This mass dispossession remains at the heart of a Palestinian understanding of the conflict, and you see it expressed in all kinds of ways to this day. For example, the image on the bottom left is a contemporary art exhibit in which the tent, representing the tents of the refugees of 1948, is inscribed with the names of these lost villages. Despite the numerous strategic disadvantages I described earlier, the local Palestinian forces and those from neighboring countries seeking to help defend their lands and families fought bravely and are seldom recognized for their valor. From a Jewish narrative frame, we think of this war as little Israel ganged up on by several bullies and somehow fending them off. For Palestinians, the picture is the opposite. Strong and well-organized Zionists, working in tandem with a European-dominated United Nations, began taking over Palestinian towns and villages even before the war broke out, and had their sights set on conquering even more. Despite the British and French having made a mess of their promised independence to Arabs throughout the region, including by manufacturing new countries like Iraq and Jordan and installing puppet monarchs there, and despite the deportation in the 1930s of many Palestinian leaders, a coalition of disparate Arab forces tried their best to come to the rescue of the Palestinians and prevent the Zionists from dispossessing them. These two narratives could not be more different. And another important part of the Palestinian narrative to know, Israeli forces committed war crimes and atrocities during the war. One of the worst took place in Lida, or Lod, as it is called in Hebrew, near the site of the Ben Gurion airport. After the Israelis conquered the town, an army officer named Yitzhak Rabin gave written orders to expel the entire population immediately. Israeli troops ordered men, women, children, and the elderly alike into the public square, gave them a short time to gather their things into sacks, and then sent them on a forced march despite intense heat. Many Palestinians died along the road that day. Jewish forces led by the Irgun whose militants had been integrated into the Israeli Defense Forces, though they maintained their own distinct units, massacred over 200 civilians at the town of Deir Yassin. And Jewish forces carried out a similar massacre at Aldoayima. The IDF also used psychological operations as part of their war strategy. While IDF leaders condemned the massacre at Deir Yassin, the IDF never spreading of false rumors that extremist units of the Israeli army were coming to more Palestinian towns to massacre and rape, leading to thousands of Palestinian villagers fleeing in fear. As Palestinians flooded into hastily set up refugee camps in the West Bank, Gaza, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, one of the things they tended to bring with them were the keys from their homes. To this day, the image of an old-fashioned key remains a powerful symbol of Palestinian resistance. Many of these refugee camps were established in the West Bank and in Gaza. In fact, about 70% of the people who live in Gaza now are the descendants of refugees from the 1948 war. The problem was so massive that the United Nations set up a special agency, UNRWA, to provide administrative support, relief supplies, and other kinds of assistance to this new population of hundreds of thousands of stateless, homeless people. If the Jewish narrative looks at the War of 48 and sees Rocky, the Palestinian narrative looks at this period and sees Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. This is an example from a popular mainstream pro-Palestinian website. The massacre in Deir Yassin was part of an official Zionist strategy to frighten Palestinians out of their land and into neighboring countries. Joseph Weitz, a member of the Jewish Agency's Transfer Committee, declared that between ourselves, it must be clear that there is no room for both people together in this country. We shall not achieve our goal with the Arabs in this small country. The only solution is a Palestine without the Arabs, and there is no other way than to transfer Arabs from here to the neighboring countries, to transfer all of them. Not one village and not one tribe should be left. Over the past, the Nakba is at the heart of the Palestinian narrative, and it is not experienced as a one-time event. Over the past 75 years, Israel has removed, expelled, or otherwise erased many more Palestinian villages and homes. When we get to the 1967 war, there is another major forced exodus of Palestinians. Through the past 5 decades of Israeli settlement expansion, many more Palestinian orchards, pasture lands, villages, and farms have been confiscated and turned into military training zones, parks, or given over to new Jewish-only settlements. In today's headlines, when we hear about the current Israeli government getting ready to vote on laws to retroactively legalize Jewish wildcat settlement outposts, Palestinians sometimes refer to these kinds of contemporary actions as part of a rolling Nakba, a process that began in 1947 and has never stopped since. I hope you all are hanging in there and doing as best you can. I know this is a pretty tough set of info for a lot of folks to take in, especially if it's the first time you've taken in some of this info. But let's keep moving forward. Palestinian art often features elements of displacement, expulsion, longing for return, resilience, and hope and faith in the young to carry on the struggle. You'll notice refugees shuffling off with their backs turned in the margins of all kinds of paintings and sketches in Palestinian art. You'll see people heading over horizons into uncertain landscapes. And everywhere, keys, the keys to people's homes, lost homes. In popular culture and graffiti, you'll also see this character, Handala, a 10-year-old boy with his back turned to the viewer. Handala, whose name is based on a native plant that bears a bitter fruit but has a deep, tenacious root system, is a ubiquitous symbol of Palestinian defiance. His back is turned in part in rejection of internationally proposed solutions to the conflict that involve Palestinians accepting humiliating or deeply unjust circumstances. His tattered clothes represent poverty. And he's everywhere in Palestinian art. Okay, coming out of the dual narrative for a moment, let's pause and consider some of the effects of the 1948 war. Israel was de facto now a sovereign Jewish homeland, and it looked sturdy enough to hold. The Soviets, French, British, and the Americans were all impressed with Israel's victory, and they were busily recalculating how their agendas might benefit from this new reality. Though there was an armistice agreement, the Arab states refused to recognize Israel, and they were horrified by the expulsion and flight of so many Palestinians into refugee camps, many of which were set up within their borders. Egypt, Jordan, and Israel were all territorial winners. Palestinians were territorial losers. They were now either living in refugee camps or else, if they were among those who had remained in Israel, they were living in a state dominated by their enemy. Also, Arab citizens of the new state of Israel were placed under a strict set of emergency laws that limited their rights for many years to come. They were not granted full equality as Israeli citizens for quite a long time. As we'll see, the UN would become a key arena in which supporters of both sides would argue for or against the legal legitimacy of the new Jewish state. I'm going to pause the two competing narratives for another bird's eye view, ground level view moment. Remember last session, I talked about a useful metaphor for understanding that some of the biggest contrasts between the two peoples in the two people's narratives. I said that one of the big contrasts between the narratives is this idea that Jews tend to bring a view from 30,000 feet up to the conflict, a view that was formed by centuries of exile and living as an unusual people spread out across many nations and continents, yet connected strongly to our lost homeland. As the 20th century clarified that Jews were at high risk of never-ending persecution, expulsion, and even extermination wherever they might live, Jews seeking to solve their crisis of survival turned to the strategies they had learned from their history, looking for sympathetic, imperial, national, or global leaders with whom they could secure a deal to set up something like a fortress, ideally in some part of their ancient homeland. When you are part of a people that sometimes is treated well in a host country, and sometimes even very abruptly, turned upon and slaughtered or expelled, being forced to move and resettle somewhere else is not the worst thing that can happen to you. Not to be flip, but for Jews, being forced to move is kind of just another frequently occurring bummer, but it is not the end. Being exterminated is the end. But when you take the time to walk in the shoes of Palestinians, you find a very different frame of reference. For centuries in Palestine, under the British, the Ottomans, and those who came before them, Arabs living in these towns, farms, villages, and cities faced a variety of periodic threats. Threats like being overtaxed, being patronized and economically exploited by imperial outside forces, being forced to accommodate the whims of different outside ruling authorities that might have included forced conscription into military service abroad, having to put up with nepotism from the Turks or the British, and having to know when to keep your head down and not cause trouble. For centuries, Palestinians had little control over who held the ultimate reins of power over the lands they lived in. But they gained a deep knowledge of those lands, and they wove a distinctively Palestinian Arab cultural life with deep intimacy and attachment to home. Unlike the Jews, they had never been forced to adapt to global wandering. Jewish identity is not threatened by being forced to move, even being forced violently to move. It's painful, it's traumatic, but Jewish identity has centuries of experience of having learned how to adapt to it. And once the next temporary home has been found, history had taught Jews how to reconnect with their worldwide network of communities and get help starting over. But for Palestinians, the story is so different. Of all the different kinds of challenges and hardships the Palestinians had learned to adapt to over many centuries, being forced to move was not one of them. In the Palestinian narrative, at least as I've done my best to hear it clearly, being forced to move is the worst thing that can happen to a people. It is the great catastrophe. A Palestinian future that ends up looking like the Jews' long centuries of exile and diaspora living is not just something Palestinians see as an outrageous injustice they're determined to fight against. In many ways, it is an unthinkable future. Home is irreplaceable. Palestine is irreplaceable. And that's why I've come to think of a Palestinian narrative as coming from a ground level view. I'm going to stop my screen share for a moment. I want to acknowledge, again, that for many of us Jews, and I'm not assuming everyone here is Jewish, but probably the vast majority of us are, learning the details of the Palestinian story of the Nakba of 1948 can be shocking and disorienting, infuriating, painful. I did not really get exposed to this story until my last year of rabbinical school, when our professor of contemporary Israeli history, the Israeli historian Ilan Peleg, presented it. I want to tell you a story about what happened as that was going on. One of my classmates at the time, someone who had grown up with traditional Jewish beliefs about the Torah and God, leaned over and told me that when he had first been exposed to modern theories that Reconstructionists love about the non-supernatural origins of the Torah, having grown up as a traditional Jew, learning that was initially very upsetting to his belief system. But as he grew up and became an independent Jewish adult, his views on the traditional beliefs about the Torah shifted. And Hence, he was studying at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and not Yeshiva University. But that day in class, my friend told me that the shock he once had felt about having his childhood religious beliefs punctured by discovering liberal Jewish theology paled in comparison to the shock and pain he felt about having the American Hebrew school story of the innocence and righteousness of the birth of the state of Israel challenged by the story of the Nakba. I told him it was a gut punch for me too. And I found myself simultaneously feeling the impulse to investigate the history further, as well as the impulse to find a way to discredit the Palestinian narrative and the ways in which hearing about it felt so threatening to me. So if you're having intense feelings, just know that that's not uncommon. And perhaps it's helpful to hold in mind that there are parts of both narratives that are deeply true and may help us imagine what a better future of coexistence and greater justice for both peoples could look like. Speaking only for myself, I can say that the dual narrative approach to studying this conflict has helped me move past the place in which I initially felt afraid that the other narrative would destroy my people's narrative. And I've been able to move forward into learning to question both narratives and understand that moral ambiguity does not have to be treated like an existential threat. I'm going to go back to our screen. So, if you were to ask why I've devoted so much of our limited time to the pre-State of Israel history and to 1948 in particular, it's because it's impossible to understand the origins of the conflict without knowing this information. And because the two narratives disagree over many major facts of this time period, and they assign moral responsibility completely differently, if you don't know the two narratives, you can't really even begin to imagine what resolving the conflict might look like. When facts are badly disputed, as these are, it becomes hard to feel certain about whether what you're reading or hearing is true, or to what degree it's true, or what context and framework is the most fair in considering the facts. We've now learned the basic Palestinian and Zionist narrative of 1948. But we should take a few moments to look at something that happened beginning in the late 1980s and early 90s that has had a big impact on the Israeli narrative. A group of prominent Israeli historians gained access to Israeli military and government archives that had been declassified after decades under seal. Using these archives, as well as thousands of live interviews, beginning in the late 80s, they published several blockbuster books about the events of 1948. They became known as the New Historians, and the narrative they presented challenged some of the long-standing claims of the standard pro-Israel narrative. However, it also disputed elements of the standard pro-Palestinian narrative. Now, I'm going to oversimplify some here because some of the new historians disagreed a lot with each other over certain facts and conclusions. But in the aggregate, here is what most of them concluded. Number one, that the international community had determined that the Jews had a legitimate claim and should have a homeland in part of Palestine, that the UN really had made that decision. Number two, that all Arab leaders rejected all international proposals for partition and walked out on the negotiations that the UN was attempting in 1946 and 47. That in parts of the territory during the war of 1948, Israeli forces did engage in deliberate and forcible ethnic cleansing. Two of these historians disagree with each other about that last fact. They disagree over whether there was really a coordinated master plan for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which is what the Palestinian narrative claims, or whether the Palestinian exodus was largely, quote unquote, born of war. Was this plan Dalit that the Palestinian narrative points to as a smoking gun really a plan for the intentional ethnic cleansing of the entire territory? Or, as other historians argue, was it a military plan for solidifying territorial gains during war and then defending against future invasion? In other words, short-term military strategy. Were Israeli commanders who intentionally expelled Palestinians from their towns, were they doing it with the intent of permanent ethnic cleansing? Or does the fact that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians remained in Israel and their descendants are Israeli citizens today lend evidence to the argument that there was not a master plan for ethnic cleansing? These Israeli historians have not come to agreement with each other about that question. Furthermore, though, these new historians do agree that Arab military forces engaged in ethnic cleansing in areas where Jews lived in the old city of Jerusalem and in surrounding areas near Jerusalem. Remember, we looked at that. It was mainly the Jordanian forces, and they expelled about 100,000 Jewish civilians who were not able to return, not until after 1967, when Israel got that territory back. These historians also agree on an important fact, which is that Israel refused to readmit Palestinian refugees following the war. And the historian whose picture you can see in the upper right-hand corner is the recently deceased Shlomo Avineri. And in one of his books, he writes, he fought in the war and he writes, "I received orders to shoot on sight Arab civilians attempting to return to their homes in Israel." Israeli leaders were pleased with the drop in the Arab population after the war and had no intention of allowing the refugees back, at least not any time in the foreseeable future, despite the argument that this may violate a key UN condition for establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. Finally, these Israeli new historians agree that Arab leaders, all of them, were unwilling to consider a peace agreement that would include recognizing Israel with refugees being part of the negotiation. The new historians agreed that Palestinian Arab militia groups used terrorism often before and during the war and did shocking and shameful things to Jewish civilians. In other words, there were atrocities committed by the Arab side. They also documented and agreed that right-wing Zionist militias, in particular members of the Irgun, used terrorism often and did shocking and shameful things, committed atrocities. One of those historians, Benny Morris, claims that there were more massacres and expulsions committed by the Israelis than by the Arabs. So I'm sharing all of this with you because this work by Israeli historians in an Israeli democratic society in the 1980s and 1990s was published and read widely and commented on and discussed by most of the Israeli population. How was the work of these Israeli historians received by Israelis? Well, as you can imagine, with tremendous controversy. Many right-wing and centrist pundits attacked the new historians, called them self-hating Jews and traitors. And even on the Israeli left, at first, this information was hard to accept, as the Israeli peace camp had largely believed that the injustice that needed to be addressed was the post-1967 Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, but that the War of 1948 was a righteous war, a clean war, and that Palestinian claims of ethnic cleansing in that war were false. On the other hand, a lot of Israelis came to accept, more or less, what the new historians taught. And today, I would argue the vast majority of Jewish Israelis would say that they think that the new historians more or less have accurately described things. It was very hard for Israelis to deny the research that went into these books because almost all of it was drawn from Israeli military and government archives. And also, as Israeli journalists in the 80s and 90s interviewed living veterans from the 1948 war, these veterans usually corroborated the findings in these books. But they didn't do so with shame. They were usually quite proud of the actions of their combat units and felt that their actions were justified in the context at the time. Now, a lot of Israel's advocates have pointed out that freedom of the press and democracy were vibrant enough in Israel that this kind of research could be done, and these books could be published without the government stopping it or the historians involved being silenced by secret state police, showing up at their doors at midnight and carrying them away, and would point out that none of the neighboring Arab regimes would likely permit such open discourse about their national founding myth. Finally, I'll say that the work of many of these Israeli new historians was greeted with mixed reviews from pro-Palestinian advocates. They got praise for validating the part of the Palestinian narrative that there really was a Nakba, a catastrophic event of loss and dispossession, including many forced expulsions. But they offered criticism over the ways in which the new historians' findings differed from the standard Palestinian narrative. Some of the new historians rejected the accusation that there was a comprehensive Zionist master plan to expel all the Palestinians, and they also validated Israeli military claims that in the midst of a fast-moving war, requiring as many Israeli troops as possible to go to the front lines, the choice Israeli military commanders often faced was whether to evacuate civilians to refugee camps or to leave troops behind to monitor and control these villages. And many Israeli commanders concluded that their duty was to move civilians out of harm's way and maximize the number of troops available to go to the front. And some of the new historians also documented the mass expulsion of Jews from the Jerusalem area and some of the strategic mistakes that were made by Arab forces. All of those things were not popular with most pro-Palestinian critics of the new historians' work. It's worth also noting that the different new historians, who are now all, I think, in their 80s, they each ended up drawing different moral conclusions from their research. Some of them became extremely left-wing, like Ilan Pappé. Some of them, like Benny Morris, ended up becoming much more right-wing than they had before they published their works. So one can't just assume how people will respond to the infusion of new information. Now, let's shift to another piece of this complicated puzzle. And I want to note that we moved from a heavily emotional part of this presentation to a much more cerebral part. And here we are. Let's return to the question of the role of the UN and international law in all of this. You may recall that in November 1947, the UN passed a resolution to partition British Mandate Palestine into a Jewish and a Palestinian Arab state. That was UN Resolution 181. Really important number to remember, 181. About a year later, the UN passed Resolution 194, which states that all Palestinian refugees from the war should be allowed to return to their homes in Israel as long as they're willing to live peaceably. Basically, 181 provides a basis in international law for there being a Jewish state in some part of this land. And 194 provides a basis in international law for the Palestinians' right of return. In May of 1949, the UN passed another resolution, 273. And the two narratives, Jewish and Palestinian, totally disagree over part of the meaning of this resolution. 273 is the resolution that admitted Israel as a member state to the United Nations. It also states that Israel's admittance to the UN is premised on the understanding that Israel will uphold the UN Charter and that Israel will uphold UN resolutions 181 and 194. Palestinians to this day argue that UN Resolution 273 states that Israel's admission to the United Nations is conditioned upon Israel honoring the demands of 194. And since Israel has never allowed the Palestinian refugees to return to their homes, it still has not met the condition required for it to be a member state of the UN. The Israeli narrative says that the debate over whether or not Israel met the requirements of 273 already happened before the UN voted to pass 273. In other words, if they'd lost that debate, the UN wouldn't have passed 273 and would not have admitted Israel, and the UN thinks that it has admitted Israel as a member state. Israel's version of events is that while there was debate before the vote on 273, pro-Palestinian leaders argued that Israel had not met the requirements of 194, and therefore that the UN should not admit them, and that Israel argued that they had complied with 194 because there was still an ongoing state of hostility because the other Arab states in the region had only reached an armistice with them, but they were all still technically in a state of war, and because several of the Arab member states that were objecting to Israel's being admitted and who were saying Israel must honor Resolution 194 had recently violated UN Resolution 181 by having attacked Israel militarily with the aim of preventing the establishment of any Jewish state at all. And therefore, they lacked the standing to argue that Israel's admission should be conditional. Now, did you follow all of that? Because I'm not even sure if I did. Maybe some of the attorneys on the Zoom meeting followed it. It's really okay if you did not follow all of that. Part of why I went through it was to illustrate how crazy making the argument between the two narratives can sound when people won't let go of their point of view about what happened back then and insist that there's only one way to look at it. The point that matters is that there is still no agreement between the two narratives on the legality of Israel. And that's important to understand. You still hear people argue on the pro-Palestinian narrative that Israel has never met the conditions required for its admission as a member state, and therefore it shouldn't be referred to as a legitimate state. It should rather be referred to as the Zionist entity or something similar. If you've been wondering where that language comes from, this argument is part of where that language comes from. And you also hear people argue that every country that refuses to acknowledge Israel's right to exist as a matter of firmly established Resolution 181 and is being hypocritical at best or anti-Semitic at worst. So you still hear that argument being made by supporters of the Zionist narrative. I want to ask if everyone could you check and make sure you've muted yourself because we're getting some noise. Could someone please, who's ever got their mic on, could you please mute yourself? Or maybe, thank you, beautiful. Okay, folks, we got through one of the hardest parts of this whole program, and we're going to talk a little bit now about the 50s and the early 60s. I'm not going to really narrate this slide, but these are some of the faces that are going to emerge into the picture. Good for you if you were quizzed and you were actually able to name every single person. I want to actually just move forward. So, for many progressive Zionists, the endless argument over whether or not the Israelis were more or less justified in their actions during the war, and over who deserved the primary moral responsibility for the nearly 800,000 new Palestinian refugees, is actually not the most difficult moral dilemma. In the end, that question gets tied up in the impossible task of trying to judge the actions of Israelis fighting a war they didn't know they would win, and that for them felt like an existential war. The more challenging dilemma is how to judge what Israel did in the years just after the war. The UN, which was the international legal body that gave Israel its legitimacy, as we just said, through UN Resolution 181, also passed UN Resolution 194, stating that all Palestinian refugees willing to live peaceably had the right to return to their homes. From 1949 onward, the Palestinians and their allies insisted that Israel take immediate steps to facilitate the repatriation of all Palestinian refugees. The Israeli government refused. Ben-Gurion's public message to Arab leaders was essentially this: first, you agree to come to the negotiating table, say that you accept UN Resolution 181 and Israel's legitimacy as a state, and then we will discuss how to deal with the refugees in those negotiations. Arab leaders' message to Israel was essentially, you don't get to treat the 800,000 refugees, many of whom you intentionally expelled, as negotiating pawns. The UN has ruled that they have a basic human right that all civilian refugees are entitled to after war's end to return to their homes and properties, and you have no right to refuse to accommodate that now. This is still the Arabs' response to Ben-Gurion. It goes on, we won't consider coming to the negotiating table to talk peace until after you've done the right thing and let the refugees return. The two sides' positions became entrenched. And before long, the Israeli government passed laws declaring that most of the property owned by absent Palestinian refugees would become state-owned land. And through this legal process, Israel ended up nationalizing, or as Palestinians say, stealing, most of this land. And I'm sorry to report, in many cases, planting Jewish national forest funds over what had been Palestinian villages. This is where a lot of the trees were planted. You can see 1958, then 1968, and 1988. This is a JNF forest. And this is a gut punch for me too, because as a Hebrew school kid, I collected money every year for the JNF. Before too long, different Arab governments began using the suffering of Palestinian refugees in camps to advance their own political agendas. Except for Jordan, none of the neighboring Arab countries were willing to offer citizenship or the opportunity to relocate outside of the refugee camps to Palestinians. And of course, in the case of smaller countries dealing with their own internal challenges, like Lebanon, with its Christian, Sunni, and Shiite populations struggling to coexist, one can understand that offering hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees citizenship would dramatically remake the ethnic and religious demographics of an already delicate balance. For me personally, the part of the story of the founding of Israel that I have the hardest time with is the unwillingness of Israel to admit the Palestinian refugees, or at least to readmit a significant percentage of them as a show of goodwill and seriousness about honoring UN Resolution 194, while also seeking to leverage the refugee crisis to get Arab states to the negotiating table. The data shows that the Israeli government really didn't want the refugees to come back. Ben-Gurion wanted the international community to respect UN Resolution 181, but turn a blind eye to 194. And yet, if international law was going to be the foundation upon which Israel's legitimacy would rest, the reality was that the UN passed both resolutions because it believed that both peoples had legitimate rights, individual rights and collective rights to self-determination with sovereignty. Also, during the 1950s, the situation for Jews living in Arab and Islamic countries worsened. Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser was the leading advocate of the cause of Arab nationalism's unfulfilled promise. Having come to power as part of an officers' coup in 1952 that ousted a monarch who had been a useful pawn of Western powers, Nasser was adept with mass media and very charismatic. He took to the airwaves repeatedly, calling for Israel's destruction and condemning supporters of Zionism around the world. He also nationalized the Suez Canal, which the British had continued to control, which precipitated a 1956 joint military attack by Israel, France, and Britain against Egypt to seize the canal and keep it in Western hands. That attack ultimately failed, and it understandably cemented in the minds of many Arabs the belief that Israel was a tool of Western colonial powers. We'll come back to that later. But in places like Algeria and Morocco, France tried to maintain its colonial rule and suppress revolutionary independence movements. In many Arab countries, Jewish communities came under intense suspicion of supporting Israel or France or both. And the fact that France had become Israel's primary weapons supplier during this time did not help. In Islamic societies where Jews had lived in large numbers for centuries, they had faced specific forms of structural anti-Semitism that would fade or intensify depending on changing circumstances. Jews would be warmly accepted, sometimes for long stretches of time, but sometimes abruptly see the tables turn and find themselves regarded as dangerous outsiders with conspiratorial intentions. By the way, the image you're seeing right now is a trek of, I believe it may be Algerian Jews who had been expelled and trying to trek their way to a camp where they can then get transportation to Israel. And this is an image of an Israeli refugee camp for recently arrived Yemenite Jewish refugees during this time. In my own family's case, my grandfather, Chaim Laziz El-Kubi, who is the man on the left in this image, and who lived in Casablanca, saw his furniture-making business shut down, his bank account frozen, and the Jews of his community in Casablanca placed under intense scrutiny by the Moroccan Arab liberation fighters, whose organization, Al-Fatah, launched a guerrilla war to oust the colonizing French. Laziz had helped some Jews leave Morocco for Israel, And when that was discovered by al-Fatah, he was told by an Arab friend of his that he was marked for execution for being a Zionist and that he needed to leave the country immediately. That very night, my grandparents and their 9 children abandoned their home and all their possessions. They paid to be smuggled into steerage on board a boat carrying Jewish refugees, along with animals and cargo, to southern France, where they were taken into a refugee camp filled with other Moroccan Jews. From there, they made their way, penniless, to Israel. They were given the most basic and crowded housing in a small town near the Syrian border where they faced shelling. My grandmother, Masuda, she's there on the far left, started going to classes to learn Hebrew, along with other mostly Mizrahi Jewish immigrants, Mizrahi Jews being Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. This is a photo of her with her classmates at Hebrew lessons. All told, about 800,000 Jews left their communities in North Africa, Arabia, and Iran, many fleeing intense persecution. Picture of additional family members on my mom's side. This is the image I wanted to get to. All told, about 800,000 Jews left their communities, many fleeing intense persecution. Just as it is not possible to ascertain precisely how many Palestinian refugees were overtly expelled from their homes, how many Palestinian refugees were people simply leaving a theater of war temporarily, and how many of them fled in fear after hearing rumors that Jews were coming for them, so too it is with the Mizrahi Jewish refugees. Some pro-Palestinian advocates have tended to minimize or deny that the Mizrahi Jews were actually persecuted or driven out, and sometimes even circulate conspiracy theories that Israeli secret agents orchestrated events to terrify Jews living in Arab lands and incentivize them to flee to Israel. These conspiracy tales to me seem like a desperate attempt to contort reality into a narrative in which only one side is the righteous victim and the other is the cruel oppressor. It's threatening to a black and white Palestinian narrative to have to admit to systematic and structural anti-Semitism being a longstanding feature of Arab and Islamic societies, but it is. And it's threatening to a Palestinian narrative to reckon with the Arab world having some collective responsibility for the collapse of Jewish societies there and the flight of the vast majority of the Jews who had lived there. On the other hand, the Zionist narrative has its own version of blame the victim conspiracy theories, seeking to deny or minimize Israeli responsibility for the expulsion of a large proportion of the Palestinian refugees. My hunch is that it takes a lot for people to flee their towns and homes and hurl themselves, their kids, their aging parents, their family members with medical conditions, and so on, into an unknown future. And whether those people are Mizrahi Jews leaving Arab countries or Palestinians leaving Palestine, it is wrong to claim that they are to blame for having fled. In any event, it's crucial to understand that the mass migration of Mizrahi Jews to Israel has had a major impact on the conflict. Today, Mizrahi Jews make up half of Israel's Jewish population, and they've had a massive impact on Israeli culture, music, and politics. They've also been, as a political bloc, reliable supporters of the right-wing parties, distrustful of Arab leaders as peace partners, and often convinced that their choices are either to be in a position of dominance or a position of subservience vis-a-vis the Palestinians, based on their collective memory of life under Islamic rule. The fact that Mizrahim also endured cultural snobbery and racial discrimination from Ashkenazi Jewish elites in Israel also plays a role in the complex dynamics of Israeli society. But these concerns pale for most Mizrahi Israelis in comparison to their pride in being Israelis and their desire to retain strategic dominance in their relationship with their Arab neighbors. On the other hand, because Mizrahi Jewish culture is also intensely Arab and represents forms of Judaism deeply influenced by Islamic values and norms, there is also the chance that Mizrahim will come to play a decisive and positive role in finding common ground with the Palestinians and building new bridges to Arab societies. All right, we're coming into the home stretch here. Before offering, go ahead.
Rabbi Harris, maybe we can turn on the chat and people can start to put some questions.
Yep. What's our time mark? Can you tell me?
Pardon me? What is your question?
What time is it?
Oh, it's 8:25.
Okay, good. Yes, I should be wrapping up in just a few minutes. So go ahead and start collecting those chat questions.
Okay.
All right. Before offering up the beginnings of two different narratives on 1967, here are a few key points. First of all, the Cold War is at its peak. And at this point, most Arab countries have allied themselves with the USSR. Second of all, the pan-Arab nationalism of this time was still being led by the charismatic Egyptian leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser. During the run-up to this war, Egypt closed a very key international waterway that created an economic crisis for Israel. For Israelis, it felt like an existential economic threat. Arab states began to mobilize their armies on the borders with Israel, and the Israelis repeatedly mobilized their reserves. And as folks know, an Israeli preemptive strike on the Egyptian Air Force in June of 1967 was the telling military blow. And the Israelis ended up winning the war and taking territory from 3 countries. And you can see they took the Sinai and Gaza from Egypt, the West Bank and the Old City of Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. I'm actually going to skip these slides about the Soviet Union and the Cold War because what I want to do is spend just a few minutes in our final moments on the Jewish narrative. As you might guess, there are 2 starkly different narratives of this war. The Zionist narrative says that the Arabs started the war in 67 by amassing troops along Israel's borders and pretending repeatedly to launch invasions, and by defying UN brokered agreements to keep Arab troops away from Israel's borders, and by blocking Israeli shipping access to key waterways, right? This is all part of the Jewish narrative of the war. Arab leaders like Nasser broadcast very bellicose public statements repeatedly so that Israelis would know what was coming for them. Israel's fragile economy, at this time more third world than first, and its citizen reserve-based army was becoming more and more stressed out by repeated "get ready to deploy, we think the invasion is coming any day" orders being sent out to reservists, leaving Israelis with no choice but to save themselves by launching a preemptive strike. And as the Israeli narrative continues, despite being outnumbered and outgunned and facing the possibility of total annihilation by Arab forces, the Israelis triumphed in a victory for the ages. For Israelis, And importantly, for Jews in North America as well, the Six-Day War ignited a sense of admiration, wonder, and pride. As one Johnson administration official put it, Israel at war destroys the prototype of the pale, scrawny Jew. The soldiers I saw were tough, muscular, and sunburned. There is also an extraordinary combination of discipline and democracy among officers and enlisted men. The latter rarely salute and frequently argue, but there is no doubt about who will prevail. For Jews around the world, a new iconic photographic image was added to the one we saw in our last session. As the American-Israeli writer Rabbi Daniel Gordis once observed, both of the images that you see on your screen are deep in the Israeli psyche, and I would add, in much of the larger Jewish psyche, especially for anybody, I would say 45 and older. On the left, a helpless little boy surrendering to Nazis in the Warsaw Ghetto. On the right, some of the first Israeli soldiers to arrive at the newly captured Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, which had until then been under Jordanian control. You still see examples, you still see expressions of this pairing of images of the shame and helplessness of being a victim during the Holocaust versus the self-affirming joy of finding one's unexpected power to fight, to prevail, to survive, and to win. So if you look at this popular internet meme that I've just put up there that claims that the Israeli soldiers in the photo are the granddaughters of the four women at the in the upper photo at the front of the line at a Nazi concentration camp. Well, this is an internet meme. I'm guessing it's pretty unlikely that that is an accurate claim. But let's also think about these images that we talked about in the last session in the Jewish psyche. Remember, we looked at the coins that the ancient Romans printed in triumph after they destroyed ancient Israel, and we looked at the images of synagoga and ecclesia that proliferated churches throughout Europe, images in which a Roman or a Christian authority is shown in glory, and Jews are depicted as female and with their heads down in shame. And I just want to point out this always chokes me up, sorry. This is part of our narrative. And that the discovery of how to fight and how to not always be kicked around is also an important part of what it means to find joy and meaning in the human experience. The fact that it also sits alongside another people's narrative, and the fact that it's tied to harms that our people has caused in other people is part of what makes this hard and complicated. But it doesn't mean that any of this isn't real for us. So I'm going to close us out today with these final thoughts about how the 1967 war transformed the Israeli psyche, the diaspora Jewish psyche, and next time we'll start with looking into the Palestinian narrative and its telling of these same events. And then that'll take us all the way through, believe it or not, to the Oslo Agreement. So I want to thank everyone for hanging in there with me all the way through another long presentation. And I'm going to ask, rather than me trying to hunt through things in the chat, if I could prevail on Irene to maybe curate questions a little bit, or let me know if you're seeing some common themes.
Yes. Okay. The first question was, at the time of the 1947 partition, how many Palestinians and how many Jews lived in the land?
That's a really good question. I should add that data to the presentation. I don't know. I have that data, but I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. I think in 1947 that the proportions were, I'm going to say, about 3-1. I think the Jewish population at that point was about a third to 40% the size of the Palestinian Arab population. Now, here's the thing. That question is a great opportunity to talk about the value of the dual narrative approach, because what the dual narrative approach does is it doesn't let people, from whatever point of view they're coming from, and I have no idea what point of view the question might have come from, or if it even came from a point of view. But what the dual narrative thing doesn't really let anyone do on either side is go, here's a fact, and then you state the fact, and then you go, aha, you see? This one side is completely out of order, and this other side is completely the victim. So let me use that fact and argue it both ways, okay? Palestinian narrative, wouldn't you know it, once again, the international community and basically everybody but us got asked to decide what could happen in our own land. And this international body arrogates to itself, without our agreement, a 50-50 split of this territory, and we outnumber them 3-1. How is that even remotely fair? Furthermore, it shouldn't have even been 3-1. It should have been like 10-1, but the British let all of these foreigners come on in without our permission. And they weren't just random foreigners, they were people coming with an agenda to start a nation for their group on our land. And they didn't even ask us permission, and we made it clear in every way we could that we were opposed to this. And then sometimes what people will do is they'll show a map and they'll say, well, here's 3-1 and here's 50-50. How is that fair? So that's one argument. Another argument would go like this, from a Zionist narrative. It would start with pointing out that when the British took over the British Mandate area, between the time the British took over in 1917 and the time of 1947, the partition, the Palestinian Arab population doubled, mostly through immigration from other Arab countries. Why? Because even though the British were pompous colonists and did rule with imperial exploitative intent, they also built an enormous amount of infrastructure. They built a ton of infrastructure that generated a shocking amount of economic activity. And they did it largely for their own agenda. They really, really, really wanted Palestine to be where everybody could stop on their trade route to India, which they never imagined they were going to lose. So anyway, point being, the British are in charge and they needed lots of labor. And so there are several 100,000 Arabs who are not of Palestinian origin who move in to British-run Palestine. A Zionist argument would say during that same time, the British put tight controls on the numbers of Jews they were wanting to allow to immigrate to Palestine. Even when they allowed the largest numbers, they still limited the number.